All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second panel, specifically on anti-corruption. My name is Jodi Vittori. I am one of the co-founders and co-moderators of the Anti-Corruption Advocacy Network, which is a loose network, all-volunteer network of about 1,600 people from around the world who work on these issues. Just to give you an overview a little bit today, first off, I would like to say happy belated International Anti-Corruption Day. That was yesterday, December 9. So just wanted to get that out there as we discuss corruption today. When we talk about what is a state, literally the Weberian definition of a state is a country, is a place that has the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. And that means that the arms trade and the people who purvey that violence are incredibly important to how a country runs and how a country's foreign policy operates. And we will be discussing the corruption side of that, because if those purveyors of violence and the weapons and other material that go with it aren't used well, it underpins everything to do with governance, democratization, the economy, and everything else. So we'll be talking about the centrality of that. If it's a country that develops security assistance, that exports security assistance, particularly when we're talking about weapons, the lobbying, the revolving door, the conflicts of interest, and the old-fashioned corruption can sustain a complex network of interactions between the government, the defense industry, the national security bureaucracy, and foreign governments. These can be greased by intermediaries, including lobbying organizations, public relations firms, think tanks, the media, and other forms of influence in ways that do not meet citizen needs, that do not forward the national security interest of that location. They also drain the treasury. They divert funds that could be used for infrastructure, for school, education, public health, and so forth, away from that into defense goods that aren't necessarily useful, that may not be what the troops need, that may not contribute to the national security of the country itself, or even that contract, what we call ghost contracts, that are never actually fulfilled. They're only things that are signed simply to move money out of the national treasury and into private pockets. On the receiving side, particularly when we're talking about kleptocratic authoritarian regimes, the receiving end of that security assistance can be equally problematic, as weapons in those countries are purchased or otherwise acquired, again, not to meet the national security interests of the country or to benefit the citizens, but instead are about kickbacks and corruption and staying in power, undermining, again, diverting funds from things like public health and schools and infrastructure that the country itself actually needs. Even worse, when we're dealing with authoritarian and kleptocratic states, is how those kickbacks and other funds from those contracts end up being utilized. In a less authoritarian or less violent sort of country, maybe one that pretends to have some democratic facade to it, what we call an anocracy or a competitive authoritarianism, we may see those funds go into political lobbying, into campaign funds, into paying off different voting blocs. Of course, in a more violent situation, we see those weapons themselves being used to go after journalists, to go after civil society, to go after the protesters in a nonviolent version of, say, the Maidan Square protests, preventing that turn to democracy, undermining good governance itself. So our three panelists today are going to be talking about different aspects of this. First is Julia Gledhill. She is a research analyst with the Stimson Center and their National Security and Reform Program. She's previously worked on the Project on Government Oversight and the Friends Committee on National Legislation. She's going to be providing that overview of the corruption-related landscape in the American arms trade here today, everything to do with export controls, procurement, ethics rules, and so forth. My second speaker today is Elsa Peraldi. She is with EG Justice. The EG stands for Equatorial Guinea. Elsa is a longtime advocate on anti-corruption. Before joining EG Justice, or rejoining EG Justice, she was a policy integration advisor with USAID's Anti-Corruption Center. She's also worked with Global Integrity. She's been a lead researcher with the Natural Resource Governance Index and Transparency International's Global Defense Anti-Corruption Index. And she is going to be talking about what happens with those authoritarian and kleptocratic regimes when those weapons come in. We chose Equatorial Guinea, which for some of you are like, where is that? It's on the west coast of Africa. It's been a country that, while the amount of security assistance from a US perspective that is provided is small, it is important to the country of Equatorial Guinea itself. But it is a highly kleptocratic, highly authoritarian state with incredible levels of gross human rights abuses. Across U.S. administrations, there has been security assistance there because of its role in natural resources, ports, strategic location in West Africa. And yet, at the same time, the country is literally almost a Hollywood parody of a kleptocratic regime. It should be a middle-income country, but so much is stolen by such a tiny elite that the vast majority of the country lives in great poverty. A very tiny elite have made incredible amounts. Just to give you an idea of what we mean by Hollywood parody, the president, Obiang, is the longest non-royal president in the world. He took over after throwing his uncle out. His uncle had been the leader at independence. The son, who is also the vice president, who has been charged with corruption in the UK, US, France, and Switzerland. Just to give you an idea, he owns so many sports cars that he would coordinate his outfits with his sports car because we wouldn't want to clash. Yeah, that would be bad. He also really likes Michael Jackson stuff, so if you're looking for one of Michael Jackson's crystal gloves or the jacket from Thriller, they're in Equatorial Guinea. So this is going to literally be a case study of how do those weapons end up in these locations and what happens when they get there to reinforce those authoritarian regimes. And then finally, Colby Goodman will be our third speaker. He's a senior researcher with Transparency International US and the Defense and Security Program there. He has formerly been the director at Security Assistance Monitor and a consultant with the Woodrow Wilson Center and Open Society Foundations. He's been a deputy director with the UN Regional Center for Peace and Disarmament in Africa. He's worked with Oxfam and at Amnesty International, where he was the director of military security and police. He's going to be building on what John talked about earlier, which is how do these weapons, despite all of these laws, end up in places like Equatorial Guinea? What are the current trends in those arms exports as it relates to corruption? And what are some of the emerging vectors in that? I will be giving each panelist up to 10 minutes to speak because these are a little bit more of the wonky side of policy stuff, to give them a little longer. I will then be quiet and turn it over to the audience and direct questions until the end of the panel. And with that, Julia, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jodi. And good morning, y'all. Great to be here, and I appreciate the invitation. I am going to set the stage for this conversation by giving y'all a very quick and dirty overview of our federal ethics rules and revolving door restrictions, and namely some of the weaknesses in those laws before we get into the nitty-gritty of sort of the impacts downstream of what I would call a porous ethics legal system. I don't think I need to convince anyone of the sheer influence that corporate and foreign entities have on the policymaking process, and of course that includes the arms trade. It feels like a lifetime ago, but we did in fact start 2025 with Bob Goldbar Menendez receiving an 11-year sentence for 4 felony counts, including conspiracy, obstruction of justice, in addition to acting as a foreign agent for Egypt and Qatar. We currently have a Deputy Secretary of Defense that formerly ran a private equity firm, deeply invested in a number of defense-related companies, including the one that trained 4 people on the hit squad that, in fact, murdered Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. So this is not even to mention the role that Doge had in Washington this year, descending on almost every federal agency in February, headed by, of course, Elon Musk, who was a special government employee, which we will talk a little bit about. So how did we end up here? How do we find ourselves with elected officials that I think many would argue have some pretty clear conflicts of interest in the policies that they are responsible for formulating? I want to start off by talking about federal ethics laws, which do complement transparency statutes like the Lobbying Disclosure Act and the Foreign Agents Registration Act. They really outline the guidelines for public officials on financial disclosures, outside income, and the like. And the main primary ethics law on the books is the Ethics in Government Act, or the EIGA. This was the law that we passed after the Watergate scandal, just to color your view of of this statute. And in so doing, lawmakers created the Office of Government Ethics, which I'm sure many of you are very aware of. And this law established really the primary post-employment restrictions that we have on the books. This is Title 18, Section 207, I believe. It also, establishes restrictions on leaving the executive branch and disclosures from high-ranking officials across the federal government, which is incredibly relevant this year when we saw a lot of hand-waving from folks like Elon Musk saying he would recuse himself from any dealings that had to do with his number of businesses. We have ethics laws on the books. We have the OGE. Unfortunately, OGE does not really have any enforcement authority to implement ethics rules. And even in the pursuit of implementation, OGE establishes regulations encouraging compliance with these ethics laws. But compliance is becoming increasingly complex, particularly as we see these financial disclosures becoming more and more convoluted as public officials sort of obfuscate their financial interests through entities like limited liability corporations, as just one example. In addition to that, our financial disclosure infrastructure really isn't as publicly accessible as it should be. Technically, these types of disclosures are supposed to be publicly accessible, and yet that is not codified. And so that is a major gap sort of in our ethics rules as far as financial disclosures go. In terms of post-employment restrictions, there is a lifetime ban on switching sides, so they say, only if a government official has what's in the legal sense called direct and substantial involvement in a particular matter. Of course, this is pretty subjective, and outside of that lifetime ban, post-government lobbying restrictions do not exceed 2 years for executive branch officials. So this is something to keep in mind as we think about what our public officials are up to and what they might be up to in the future, of course. So this leads me to talk a little bit about our lobbying disclosure infrastructure. The main statute is the Lobbying Disclosure Act, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. I know I myself have registered under the LDA when I worked with the Quakers. But I'd like to start out talking about lobbying just by saying that total spending on federal lobbying increased by 62% from 2000 to 2024, while registrations increased by only 4%. That's 62 compared to 4% increase in registrations. So clearly, there's a bit of a discrepancy here in terms of what's actually happening and what the government is really aware of in terms of the true extent of lobbying to our federal government. One of the main reasons for this is that we have a pretty narrow definition of what constitutes lobbying. For example, there is a pretty gaping loophole called, many call it the strategic counseling loophole, wherein unless you are the person directly contacting a government official, you might not have to register under the Lobby Disclosure Act. So you might leave Congress, for example, and run a team of lobbyists and say, go talk to XYZ person, but if you are not doing that yourself, you do not have to register. And so this is why Public Citizen found in 2019 that nearly 2/3 of former members of Congress avoided restrictions imposed by the LDA simply by avoiding that direct engagement with lobbying contacts, even if they were working for private lobbying firms, consulting firms, or with business and trade groups. Finally, I'm going to touch very briefly on the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which has been, I think, a greater focus for the Justice Department since the 2016 election. There has been a little bit more attention paid, 13 cases forward in the last 3 years. But, important to remember, this law focuses entirely on transparent registration and disclosure by agents of foreign principals. It does not prohibit any activities. And so, in addition to that, there are 8 exemptions for FARA registration. One of them is actually, hey, if you are registered under the Lobby Disclosure Act, you don't need to register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. There's also a commercial exemption. So if you are engaged in, truly commercial activities on the part of a private business interest, you might be able to take advantage of that. It's actually quite indistinguishable from the LDA exemption. So there's a couple different ways that you can work this. And the reason I bring that up is because in March, there was institution of a new rule that sort of changed the way that we view beneficial ownership or who truly owns companies. That makes it a lot easier for people to use these types of exemptions to registration under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. So I've really breezed through 3 really big statutes and some of the weaknesses in them that I think allow the revolving door to spin and for corporate and foreign influences to sway the policymaking process and, of course, the arms trade. I can touch on a few solutions which have, been, I think, proposed by several different groups, including in this room for years. And there are obvious ones like narrowing what we consider lobbying to be, making ethics waivers and exemptions, publicly accessible and searchable, including not just the ethics waivers provided to folks like Elon Musk to be special government employees because their contributions to government outweigh the potential detrimental impacts caused by, financial conflicts of interest, but also the exemptions that are provided for folks that otherwise would recuse themselves from certain dealings in the government. So this goes both ways, right? It's not just private folks coming into government, but also if you're in government, you should have to recuse yourself from dealings that have to do with companies that you might have formerly worked for. And then finally, publicize the individuals that actually are exempted from FAIR registration through LDA. We actually don't even know what that discrepancy looks like, how many people are taking advantage of that exemption, and I think that it would shine a lot of light on the ways in which foreign entities in particular are swaying the policymaking process through potentially more commercial activities. And again, there's a lot of subjection there that is very debatable and I think creates open space for undue influence on our policymaking process. So I'll pause there.
All right. Thank you very much, Julia, for that. I'm going to turn it over to Elsa now, as we've talked about where the loopholes and things like lobbying that enable companies to push for these weapons to be exported. Let's talk about what happens on the other side.
Thank you, Jodi, and very happy to be here with you all. And I think it's super important, given that yesterday was Anti-Corruption Day, today human rights, they're so entrenched and go hand with hand. So Equatorial Guinea, Jodi gave a really good overview of the context of the tiny country in West Africa. It's the only Spanish-speaking country in Africa and the longest dictatorship. I also like to say it has always lived under dictatorships or regimes. So before it was a Spanish colony under Franco, and the legal system is still the Franco system. So you can imagine how you go from there. So the US is in danger of propping the world's longest dictatorship, inadvertently reinforcing the Obiang's family contributing hold on power. And we have seen a shift, a very noticeable shift of policy. Previous administrations attempted to do that balance of economic interests, especially those tied to oil companies, because there used to be oil companies there, with a modicum public support on human rights and anti-corruption measures. But recently, we've seen decisions that suggest an increasing willingness to turn a blind eye to governance and human rights violations to advance a very narrow geopolitical agenda. Historically, well, at least the 2 previous administrations, the U.S. was cautious in engaging with, who Jodi was mentioning, Teodoro Obiang Mange, known as Teodorin, the son of the the president, because of his well-known corruption and well-documented money laundering allegations, including a big DOJ settlement. It was one of the first settlements of the kleptocracy initiative that has been now dismantled. So it made the direct engagement politically and ethically sensitive. But under the current administration, however, the posture has shifted and there is more direct engagement. They just gave him a visa to visit, contrary to previous State Department practice. And of course, he loves to flaunt all his visits and lavish lifestyle on social media. So we saw him visiting Jay Leno and his cars and visiting the US State Department authorities, etc. So we have also seen military cooperation expanded, even though, as Jodi mentioned, is little. In fiscal year 2024, we saw an increase to 500,000, and that's an additional 100,000 for Equatorial Guinea, despite being a Tier 3 on State Department's trafficking in persons report and very credible reports on human rights violations and torture. And this assistance, as we heard in the previous panel, needed a waiver to bypass the restrictions, statutory restrictions designed to prevent security assistance going to governments implicated in human rights violations. And more recently, two months ago, Equatorial Guinea received 7.5 million from State Department's humanitarian assistance to receive third-party nationals. To a detention facility built in Obenga Sem, which is rumored to be having housed the first deportees just now in the end of November. And we have heard from former prisoners, and based on their conversations with their prison guards, that US funds were used to build that prison facility. And Equatorial Guinea is notorious for all the human rights violations, but also the prison conditions are deplorable. The country lacks effective institutional checks and balances. The governance context remains deeply challenging. And it has been widely documented of how the banks and their allies plunder the country coffers for personal bank accounts. So you heard of the Michael Jackson memorabilia. There is also a replica of Neverland and the Bugattis and the Gulfstreams, etc., so U.S. military assistance strengthens an accountability-free security apparatus. Civil society efforts to promote transparency and accountability have been severely restricted, while anti-corruption measures promoted by international financial institutions, World Bank, IMF, they function more as formalities rather than oversight mechanisms. E.g. Justice, the organization I represent, has documented a pattern of torture, arbitrary detention, harassment, kidnapping, you name it. Amnesty International as well, and you name it. Everyone has documented all the human rights violations, all enabled by a judiciary that is completely controlled by the Obiangs. And unfortunately, US military education programs and related engagements legitimize the security forces who are implicated in these abuses. Equatorial Guinea remains the lowest ranking, one of the lowest ranking countries in Transparency International Corruption Index, and it has one of the highest per capita incomes in Africa due to the oil revenues. But the country has one of the most severe gaps of human development, as Jodi was saying, and national wealth. Large segment of populations have lack to basic services, clean water, education, and the U.S. continuing engagement without strong governance or human rights conditions risks reinforcing these systematic inequalities. U.S. training and cooperation programs without robust safeguards may become a more symbolic cover for engagement with a very entrenched authoritarian system, where all the senior leadership is pretty much family related to the president. And so the security forces operate with total immunity, and this assistance is enabling that.
All right, thank you. So we've discussed the fact, and John discussed the fact, that the United States has pretty good, in theory, export control laws that include requirements to check that countries aren't diverting, they can afford the weapons, that they aren't diverting the weapons, or that they aren't diverting money for schools and so forth to those weapons, et cetera. So Colby is now going to explain, how is this stuff getting shipped out anyway?
Jodi? Oh, there we go. So Jodi, thanks so much for the invitation, and Jeff as well, and Jeff better because I'm on the board of the Forum on Arms Trade, so full disclosure. I'm going to talk about something that's maybe a little dull and technical, but I'm going to, and this is sort of defense company reporting on political contributions, commissions, and fees when they submit an export license. But I'm going to give it a different lens, a different spin to hopefully make it a little more engaging and see why I'm so fascinated with it. The reason I'm talking about it now is the State Department is currently reviewing this notification and deciding whether to keep doing it and maybe not doing it. It's not quite clear. And it's also like provides a great window, I think, into looking at sort of a long-standing debate about arms sales and corruption in the State Department. Next slide, please. Yeah. So I was at a export compliance conference like a couple of months ago, and one of the European defense company representatives said, you know, this defense company reporting on political contributions and commissions, it's not really export controls, right? It's just corruption. So why is it in the arms export control regulations? And I've actually heard similar views from some State Department officials. They're like, oh, I work on that, you know, sort of cover arms sales. I work on national security issues and export control. I don't work on corruption. But there's a lot of course, other officials within the State Department have a completely different view. They view assessing corruption risk in arms transfers as like a core national security interest and integral to preventing illicit arms deals and diversion. Next slide, please. So where did we get these Part 130 notifications? They exist because when Congress created the Arms Export Control Act in the 1970s, Congress uncovered a set of scandals that looked more like covert operations, maybe, than corporate misconduct. U.S. defense companies were paying military officials, political officials, royal families, political parties, all to influence weapons deals. And these operations actually destabilized allied governments, including Italy and Japan. I think there was someone from the Japanese embassy that may be here. No, okay. And helped to bring about political forces in allied countries that were hostile to the U.S. interest. So Congress created Part 130 reporting requirements to sort of expose the financial operatives inside arms deals, the brokers, the fixers, the political middlemen who operate in these sort of shadows. And I'm not going to get into the technical stuff, so you can see like when it's required. I mean, think of this really as sort of like a surveillance camera in a way in the lobby of where arms deals are happening.
Can you mention what DCS and FMS is?
Oh, right. So Part 130 notifications apply to both commercial and government-to-government sales. So DCS is the commercial, direct commercial sales, and FMS is the government-to-government foreign military sales. Thank you. Yeah. Next slide. Okay. There's two sort of main utilities of this tool. For the past decade, Part 130 has repeatedly served as sort of a financial forensic tool for U.S. agencies, often Justice Department, Defense Department, sometimes even companies will say, hey, we've got a problem here, can you help us figure this out? And the State Department will look at these reports and find missing reports or incomplete reports or inconsistent reporting. And this action has led to some pretty big prosecutions, often deferred prosecutions, and including illicit or corrupt payments to Czech Republic, Ghana, Hungary, Qatar, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Sri Lanka. The list goes on, by both U.S. firms and European firms that are shipping U.S. weapons. And these schemes, these illicit schemes, have sort of negatively affected competition between U.S. and defense firms, political election outcomes in Benin, for example, and the overall integrity of weapons procurement. Some of these concerns have actually been voiced by U.S. generals and Defense Department officials that, hey, we need this tool, we need something like this to go after, in particular, UN defense companies that are hurting American defense companies. So the next slide. This one isn't used as much, but Part 130 can also be a really important proactive investigative tool. So imagine the State Department as sort of like a immigration control at the border of a weapons sale. And every broker or consultant in the deal needs a passport to participate. But sometimes a broker appears on the Part 130 form, but not on the export license. These hidden or unlicensed brokers are sort of like the State Department saying, some people, you don't need a passport. So if it's used properly, it can screen out sanctioned brokers, intermediaries tied to organized crime, corruption, actors involved in arms diversion networks. And And I mean, I think this is really important now because over the past decade, the State Department has decreased their oversight of foreign arms brokers. So there's huge gaps that this sort of reporting can spot. So, next slide, thank you. Despite these benefits and successes, the current system has some pretty big vulnerabilities. The big one is State Department doesn't recognize the value of it. And this blinds them to how corruption can lead to partners buying faulty weapons or paying exorbitant prices, which complicates the new U.S. national security strategy, where we want to shift the security burden to other countries. This doesn't really work. And then, of course, we can't really see brokers that might be involved in diverting U.S. weapons. Another one I want to highlight is that reporting is often inaccurate. So companies, because they're concerned about compliance, they overestimate like a lot because of the way the arms sales work, and so then you have situations where you can't really use the tool as a red flag to identify sort of like questionable payments. Next one. All right, opportunities. I mean, I think the good news is actually the defense industry wants reform here. And they have proposed some like viable solutions. I don't completely agree with them, but they have some, I think, some good, and because they're concerned about the sort of overestimation of the payments. So my recommendation, which is similar to theirs, is sort of replace the transaction by transaction reporting to a semi-annual reporting. And this would improve accuracy by allowing companies to use actual invoices, actually reduce burden on industry, and give State Department a wider view of who is sort of intercepting the phone call and who is being paid and why. And I guess we'll just leave you with Part 130 is one of the few tools that can shine a light into this shadow system. And if we can modernize it with better reporting, better analysis, better technology, we can equip the State Department with something, a really powerful tool to have a better window into the visibility of these hidden actors and payments, and that are often sort of steering and influencing arms trades in ways that the U.S. and others don't. So yeah, anyway, I invite you to get engaged with me, learn about this issue, help me push it.
Thank you. If there's any questions in the audience, we will group them in the interest of time, and so we can get a little bit back on track. And because I'm standing between you and coffee and Oreo cookies, I have priorities. Any questions? We stunned you with our brilliance on corruption. Yeah, Amanda?
Colby, hold on a second.
Oh.
Thanks so much. Colby, your recommendations, particularly on semi-annual reporting, would that require a statutory change, or is that something that could be implemented without congressional action?
No congressional action is needed. So DTAG, and this is where sort of industry comes in, the Defense Trade Advisory Group, which is sort of affiliated with the State Department's Political Military Bureau. They've come up with a number of reports, and they've really looked into the statutory aspects, and they've consistently said, no, you don't need that. So they're pushing for an annual report. I think, I think a semi-annual would be better because payments change, and if you're doing an effective screening, I think you need a little shorter window.
Other questions in the audience? All right, in that case, I turn you over to the coffee, the tea, the Oreo cookies, and everything else bad for you.